and good evening. That is how Macbeth begins. Thunder and lightning. It introduces us to a world of discord, disruption, fear. It's the world of Macbeth. But I want to start just by talking about where this play came from. Where did the world of Macbeth come from? The play itself dates probably from about 1605, 1606. And this is the full chronology of Shakespeare's plays. And the reason I'm giving you the full chronology is that I want you to get a sense of where Macbeth fits in Shakespeare's career. So this is the beginning of the career, and now this extraordinary middle period of Shakespeare's productive life. So notice 1604, 1605, Othello, which I decided this afternoon is my favorite play. 1605, 1606, King Lear. 1605, 1606, Macbeth. So here are these two very dark, very nihilistic plays written in the same year. Again, these years are not accurate, these are all approximations. And then 1606, Antony and Cleopatra, 1607, 1608, Coriolanus. So we have this extraordinarily productive period in which most of the great tragedies are written, in the middle of which we have Macbeth. Now, we have actually an eyewitness account of a performance of Macbeth in 1611, so we know it was written by 1611. But we also think it was probably performed for the king at court, probably around 1606. So that's how that date is chosen. The other way we know approximately when it was written is because the play is filled with contemporary references, political references, and social references from the period. Now, the source of the play is this book. This is the source, actually the larger version, this is one volume of it. Hollinson's Chronicles of England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. This is Shakespeare's source for all of his history plays. It turns out that the story of Macbeth is the story of a real king. Macbeth reigned between 1040 and 1057 as King of Scotland. Probably he did kill his predecessor. I guess that was a popular sport in those days. And the first 10 years of his reign were very successful. He was a good king. But then later, as the legend goes, because there's also this whole legend that accrues to Macbeth. This legend of his killing the king really doesn't appear until about 1300. So we have an historical basis for Macbeth. We have no historical basis for Banquo, though traditionally Banquo has been seen as a co-conspirator of Macbeth. Of course, in this version of the story, Banquo is not a co-conspirator. He is whatever the opposite of a co-conspirator would be. He's a character who's been designed to contrast with Macbeth. And it is Banquo's heirs who will ultimately take the throne of Scotland. Now, more about that in a second. What's going on in this period? Well, Queen Elizabeth I reigned until 1603. She dies in 1603, having ruled England for some 45 years. And she is succeeded by James I. James I of England was James VI of Scotland. His mother was the famous Mary Queen of Scots, whom Elizabeth had beheaded. Mary was a Catholic, which is one of the reasons she was an enemy of Elizabeth. James was a Protestant. That is kind of relevant to this play. So James now comes down to England, takes the throne, and becomes King James I of England. Now, interesting thing happens in 1603 after James becomes king. at least interesting thing theatrically. Shakespeare's acting company under Queen Elizabeth, and let me, such a side note, if you had an acting company, you had to have a patron. If you didn't have a patron, you didn't get a license. You didn't get a license, you didn't play plays. So the patron under Elizabeth I was the Lord Chamberlain. So Shakespeare's company was the Lord Chamberlain's men. But it was easily the best acting company in London. When James becomes king, he becomes the patron of Shakespeare's acting company, and the company becomes the King's Men. So one of the things when you've got a new boss is that you want to keep your boss happy, right? So, though there's some debate about this, well, you may acknowledge that, it's logical that Shakespeare would want to write a play that would make his boss happy. And so he writes this play which is filled with issues that James I is interested in. First of all, James is interested in politics. He's interested in the nature of kingship. He wrote treatises on the nature of kingship. He believed that the king was chosen by God, that the king rules by divine right. Macbeth, of course, is a usurper. He has stolen the crown from God's anointed king, King Duncan. So the play explores, among other things, and we're going to be talking about a lot of things the play explores tonight. The play explores, what does it mean to kill a king? And it considers a very basic, at least for the Renaissance philosophical question, can a bad man be a good king? Simple answer, no, a bad man cannot be a good king. So here in this play we see the results of a regicide in Scotland, and the results on Scotland, and the results on King Macbeth. But although it addresses political issues, this is not a political tragedy. This is a tragedy of an individual, of one man, and actually one man and one woman, caught up in medieval, as it were, politics. Now, James was also, and I think more significantly, interested in witches and in the supernatural. In 1597, and I admit the date on this one is 1603. In 1597, James had published a treatise on demons, on demonology. The 1597 edition was published in Scotland. Once he became King of England, he now republishes it in 1603 in England. In it, among other things, he defends the existence of witches. So we have here a Scottish play which involves the murder of a king, in which, and I hate to have a pun, in which the action of the play is sparked by witches. I just have to tell you, I really wanted to call this talk Which Witch is Which, but I decided against that. So these are all appeals, topics that are designed to appeal to King James. By the way, and I think this is kind of an interesting note, the witches are never called witches in the play. They are always referred to as weird sisters. I almost said something about my own sister. Anyway, they're always referred to as weird sister. But what's really interesting in the published text of the play, and the screen that was up when you came in the room, was the first page of the first folio copy of the play. And the play first appeared in the first folio. I'll talk about that in a sec. They're always referred to as weird sisters, but in all of the stage directions of the play, they're called witches. Just never so in the text of the play. Now, we also get a play which is full of compliments to the king. Banquo, remember, is a mythological character. But part of the myth is that King James is
one of the heirs of the line of Banquo. So to use this character to announce that this man will be the father of this line of kings whom we'll see in the fourth act of the play is to compliment James I. And when we see that line of kings in the fourth act, the last one is a portrait of James I. So Shakespeare is directly addressing the family of the king, the history of the king, the mythology behind James's kingship. Macbeth is the shortest tragedy in the Shakespeare canon. And just to throw some numbers at you, these are the major tragedies: Hamlet, Othello, Lear, Macbeth. Hamlet, of course, is the longest play. It's some 3,906 lines and runs for about 4 to 4.5 hours, depending how quickly the actors talk. Othello is 3,685 lines, runs about 3.5 hours. King Lear, 3,286 lines, about 3.5 hours. And Macbeth, almost 1,000 lines shorter. Its running time is 2 hours to 2.5 hours. So this is the shortest of Shakespeare's tragedies. And there are probably a couple of reasons for this. First of all, the only source we have, as I just mentioned, for the play, for the text of the play, and there are always all kinds of textual issues when you're talking about Shakespeare. The only source we have is the folio, the first folio of 1623. But it's possible that that first folio version has been adapted from a performed version that was performed at court in 1606. So it was played before the king, and it contains all these compliments and contemporary references. But remember, we have that eyewitness account of a performance in 1611. And that eyewitness account talks about a play that's longer than the folio and has scenes that do not exist in the folio. There's also some evidence that after 1611, Macbeth was revised, probably not by Shakespeare. And so there are additional scenes in the folio text that were written probably by a playwright named Thomas Middleton, who would have worked with Shakespeare. So that folio text has been shortened and lengthened. That makes no sense at all. At the same time. So we have this short play. Now, there's another really interesting, I think, reason why Macbeth is really short. King James told the court he didn't like long plays. So Shakespeare wrote him a short one. Right? Despite its brevity, relative brevity, it's extraordinarily dense. Its action is extraordinarily efficient. And it put a period there. It's just dense and efficient. As I was preparing, it's amazing how tight this play is. By the way, as you may know, theater people are very superstitious. And they are especially superstitious about this play. This play is a bad luck play. And if you're in the theater, you never refer to it by its name. If you're in the theater, it is always called the Scottish play. So if you're ever talking to an actor and you're talking about this play, it's the Scottish play. Now, this is a very dark play, almost literally, because most of the play takes place at night. It's also, as we know, deeply rooted in the supernatural, witches and ghosts. It's the only play, or I should say the only tragedy of Shakespeare, in which the tragic hero is a villain. Richard III, kinda, but not really a tragic hero. So we've got this hero who's a villain, a man whose wife encourages him to murder their king, who then commits a whole series of murders after that. his ambitious wife, also becomes a tragic figure in the play. So, how does Macbeth, this apparently good man at the beginning of the play, become the murderous tyrant we see at the end of the play? And given his murderous reign, why do we care about him? Let's first look at the plot. Macbeth is the thane of Glamis. A thane is like an earl or a baron, right? And he's a cousin of King Duncan. They had the same grandfather, so they're first cousins. He is also the greatest general in the Scottish army. And as the play opens, he's returning home victorious in battle, traveling with his friend and fellow general, because they're both commanders of the Scottish forces, Banquo. Suddenly, they encounter three weird sisters. And this, by the way, is the plate, the copper plate in Holinshead's History of Scotland. So I love this because you've got these very Renaissance generals meeting these very generous Renaissance ladies who are witches. So I just love that image. So they encounter the three weird sisters. And these sisters greet Macbeth with a prophecy. All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, thane of Glamis. All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, thane of Cawdor. All hail Macbeth, that shalt be king hereafter. They also greet Banquo. And they greet Banquo as lesser than Macbeth and greater, not so happy yet much happier. Thou shalt get kings, though thou be none. Next thing you know, the first part of the prophecy comes through. True, Macbeth is made thane of Cawdor, in addition to his title of Glamis. That gets him thinking about the next part of the prophecy, how to become king. He sends his wife a letter telling her about his encounter with the witches and about their predictions, and she thinks that Macbeth becoming king is a pretty good idea. Oops. She thinks that becoming king is a pretty good idea. How to manage it? Only by killing the current king, Duncan, who happens to be spending the night at Macbeth's castle. Although Macbeth is now reluctant to kill his king, Lady Macbeth convinces him to commit the murder. She argues that if he were a real man, he would do it. That night, as Duncan sleeps, Macbeth stabs him to death, placing the blame on Duncan's guards, whom he kills, and on Duncan's sons, including the heir, Malcolm, who had fled Scotland. Macbeth is then named as the new king because he is first cousin of the king. But Macbeth's increasing guilt over the murder leads him to feel insecure in his new position, afraid that somehow the truth will be discovered. He must have any possible threats destroyed, starting with his friend Banquo, who knows the witch's prophecies and may have suspicions about Duncan's murder. Ooh. Sorry, that's Mr. and Mrs. Macbeth. Laurence Olivier and Vivian Leigh. So Macbeth must also have Banquo's son Fleance killed, because then he can't be the father of kings. Now, this is an interesting conundrum for Macbeth. Macbeth wants the first half of the prophecy to come true. He wants to be king. But he doesn't want the second half of the prophecy to be true. He doesn't want Banquo to be the father of kings. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way, as he discovers. Banquo is killed, but Fleance escapes. Later that evening, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are hosting a banquet for the nobles, at which Banquo was expected to be attending. During the party, however, Banquo's ghost appears to Macbeth. That's Banquo's ghost upstage there. Banquo's ghost appears to Macbeth And Macbeth, driven by his terror at the sight and by the threat that the ghost represents, now knows he must secure his kingship no matter the cost. Racked by both fear and guilt, unable to sleep, Macbeth searches out the witches yet again. They give him prophecies that suggest he is invulnerable. He cannot be defeated until Burnham would come to Dunsinane, i.e. the forest, that is the forest outside his castle. His castle is named Dunsinane, moves toward the castle, and he cannot be killed by any man born of woman. At his request, they also show him images of all the Scottish kings who will descend from Banquo. He feels invincible. Macbeth essentially goes on a killing spree to wipe out any who might threaten his crown, even has the wife and children of his main opponent, Macduff, slaughtered, and this is the slaughter of Macduff's children. Macduff, you see, has left them vulnerable when he goes to join Malcolm and his anti-Macbeth forces in England. You've got to wonder what kind of guy Macduff is, too. Eventually, his exiled enemies return, including Malcolm and Macduff, who leads English troops, return to Scotland. Lady Macbeth, haunted by her own guilt for the murder of Duncan and haunted by nightmares, tries to wash off evidence of her crime as she walks the castle in her sleep. As Macbeth is preparing to fight his enemies, he receives news of his wife's death. At the start of the battle, Birnam Wood does come to Dunsinane as the opposing soldiers cut off branches, hold them in front of themselves so that nobody can tell how many troops there actually are. Macbeth is then defeated by Macduff, who had a cesarean birth and therefore is not a man born of women. Macduff defeats Macbeth in battle and beheads him. Duncan's son, Malcolm, then becomes the rightful king of Scotland. So that's kind of a rough overview of the plot of this play. And we're going to start looking in it and at it and look at some of its details. So this story of a good man who's seduced by worldly pleasures, or a good man who in this case is seduced by worldly power, has its roots actually in traditional English theatrical form called the morality play. And this is the most famous English morality play. If you were ever an English major, you would have studied this play. It's called Every Man. And it shows us, this is, as I said, this is the cover. This is every man. And every man, of course, is representative of every man. And this is death. So the morality plays were created around the beginning of the 14th century in England, although I know there are a similar type of play in Spanish literature. And their intention is to introduce and to illustrate the religious doctrine of grace. This is a medieval form of drama that Shakespeare would have been familiar with. There are various forms of morality plays still being acted as Shakespeare was growing up, still being written in the 1590s. As a kid, he probably would have seen these plays performed by traveling actors who would travel around, especially when there was a plague in London. And they would have played these plays in the fields outside Stratford-on-Avon, which is Shakespeare's hometown. In fact, it's perfectly possible that Shakespeare joined one of these traveling acting companies and escaped Stratford, ending up as an actor in London. That's what we think. That we're not quite sure how he got there, but we think it's perfectly possible that he would have joined one of these acting companies. Now, the morality play is rooted in the notion that everyone can sin, but everyone can also be saved from damnation by God's grace, through repentance, and through penance. So the structure of a morality play is pretty simple. A good man is approached by the devil or is tempted by the pleasures of the world. And in a morality play, the pleasures of the world are actual characters in the play. These vices and virtues in the play are personified. He enjoys the pleasures of a frivolous life along with his friends. And this is the everyman figure, obviously in the 19th century drawing, everyman figure with his riches, having a great time. But when death comes to take him, he's terrified of damnation. And he turns to his friends, riches and lust and gluttony. And he asks them to join him, to go with him, to support him in his dying. But all the worldly pleasures abandon him. Of course, only the virtues are willing to accompany him to death. And so every man realizes the vanity of worldly things, rejects the false pleasures of his world, and repents. He is ultimately saved from damnation. So for the morality play, we have a story of tragedy that's avoided. But for Macbeth, tempted by the witch's prophecies, there is no redemption. And so, on one level, this play becomes the story of the damnation of a good man's soul. Like the history of a mystery play, at the end, Macbeth realizes the vanity of worldly ambition, but for him, repentance, penance are impossible. There is no grace for Macbeth. There is no salvation. As Macbeth's kingship descends into tyranny and murder, he realizes that he has, he says, given mine eternal jewel to the common enemy of man. That eternal jewel, of course, is his soul, the common enemy of man, Satan. In the morality play, tragedy is avoided through God's grace. Here, however, tragedy is inevitable. At the beginning of the play, it's clear Macbeth is viewed by those around him as an exceptional man, a noble man. And in fact, most of the second scene of the play is about making clear Macbeth's nobility and his bravery. These are the heights that he will fall from. Before he meets the three weird sisters, he's referred to as brave Macbeth. He's praised as Bellona's bridegroom. This is a comment on his skill as a soldier. Bellona is the goddess of war. Banquo calls him my noble partner. King Duncan calls him my worthy cousin, and noble Macbeth. So at the outset, he's established as a man who is brave and noble, an able warrior for his king and for his country. Later in the play, he becomes this tyrant, something wicked, this fiend of Scotland, and finally, this dead butcher. How does this happen? Well, to answer that, we need to look, first of all, at the three weird sisters, the witches. We meet the witches in the first scene of the play. There's our friends, the witches. First scene of the play. That's the entire first scene of the play. It's 12 lines, starting with the thunder and lightning we started with tonight. That's it. And yet, in those 12 lines, Shakespeare lays out much of, or many, I should say, of the ideas and the issues that are going to be explored in this play. There's a storm. We're introduced to a world at war. There is a hurly-burly. That's the war they're referring to. This is the world that's established in the first scene. The witches and their accompanying storm are a reflection of the existing disquiet in the world. Indeed, in the universe, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a second, it's a disquiet introduced with that thunder and lightning. Shakespeare's contemporary believed in an ordered universe established by God at the creation. This is God's ordered universe. I might add, we were talking about the divine king, and we're going to come back to that also. This is, one of these days I'm going to learn how to use these. This is God at the top, and this is all the levels of nature through the angels and human interactions and stuff. You could just as easily put a king at the top of that. And these could be the levels of social interaction. So, in this ordered universe, there was a proper place for everyone and for everything, including, as I just suggested, this hierarchy in human society. To upset this order, for example, to assassinate a king, is to move the universe toward chaos. Now, understand what it means for a Renaissance person when you talk about chaos. Chaos is a complete reversion of the universe to the world, or I should say the universe before creation, before any order, because God imposed that order, right? So if we go back to chaos, it's truly chaos. I can't think of another word for it. Clearly, the existence of the witches is not consistent with universal order. They are associated with the confusion, they're associated with the storm, they're associated with the hurly-burly. And out of that first scene, those 12 lines, will emerge the murder of Duncan. And out of that act comes an increasing chaos within Scotland itself. To kill Duncan is to feed disorder. The king is God's representative on earth. He's divine. He's at the top of the earthly social order. And remember, King James fully believed this. It's turned into a major political problem for him. So to kill Duncan doesn't just upset the kingdom. It's an upset that's reflected throughout nature. And we hear about this upset the night Macbeth kills the king. Nature itself reacts immediately. The night has been unruly. Where we lay, our chimneys were blown down, and as they say, lamenting heard in the air, strange screams of death and prophesying with accents terrible, of dire combination and confused events new hatched to the woeful time. The obscure bird clamoring the livelong night. Some say the earth was feverous and did shake. The obscure bird is the owl, which of course doesn't clamor all night. My young remembrance cannot parallel a fellow to it. And in fact, the severity of this upset is re-emphasized in the next scene, now with a specific reference to Duncan's murder. 70 I can remember well within the volume of which time I have seen hours dreadful and things strange. But this sore night hath trifled former knowings. Ha, good father, thou seest the heavens as troubled with man's act threatens his bloody stage. By the clock 'tis day, and yet dark night strangles the traveling lamp. Is it night's predominance or day's shame that darkness does the face of earth entomb when living light should kiss it? 'Tis unnatural, even like the deed that's done. Much of the succeeding action of Macbeth reflects this breakdown. We see it in the state of Scotland itself. We see it in its increasing suffering under Macbeth's kingship. And we see it in Macbeth and Lady Macbeth as they become more and more murderous. Only at the end of the play, with Macbeth's death and the elevation of Malcolm to the kingship, is order returned to Scotland, and orders returned to the universe. That is, by the way, the conventional ending of an Elizabethan tragedy, restoration of order. Now, in addition to the hurly-burly of the world of the play, in the first scene, we're also introduced to a world of dualities, of double meanings, which dominate this play. Macbeth's going to call them a double sense. This doubleness is central to the witches' prophecies, and much of Macbeth's world exists in two aspects. The witches refer to the time in which the battles lost and won. Both sides of the battle, losing and winning. You know, it never occurs to us, does it, that losing and winning happens simultaneously in a battle. But the witches are always aware of that doubleness. They prophesy that Banquo will be lesser than Macbeth and greater, not so happy, but yet much happier. Thou shalt get kings, though thou be none. Double, 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 both sides, simultaneous. More significantly, the witch's world is one in which fair is foul and foul is fair. This notion dominates the play. And in fact, when Macbeth enters in the next scene, he echoes this very line. So foul and fair a day I have not seen. That's his first line. In Shakespeare's plays, there's also always a basic dichotomy, a duality, between reality and illusion, between what people and things appear to be and what they really are. Here we see this dichotomy clearly in the actions of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth early in the play. They appear to be faithful subjects and kinsmen of King Duncan while they plot to murder him. And they must appear innocent after the murder. Macbeth must appear to be Banquo's friends when he's actually planning to have Banquo and his son murdered. As Duncan is arriving at their castle, Lady Macbeth tells her husband, to beguile the time, look like the time. Bear welcome in your eye, your hand, your tongue. Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. Just before they murder Duncan, Macbeth tells Lady Macbeth to mock the time with fairest show. False face must hide what the false heart doth know. But putting on a false face becomes harder and harder for Macbeth. When Banquos Ghost appears at his banquet for the nobles, Macbeth finds it impossible to hide his terror, despite Lady Macbeth's attempt to cover up, to lie for him. Ultimately, as the play moves forward, Macbeth doesn't care anymore about appearances. He doesn't care anymore about creating illusions. Both his thoughts, that inner self, and his actions will be bloody. Now, there's also always a double meaning in the witch's prophecies, a difference between what they appear to mean and what they really do mean. Thus, the prophecies can all be interpreted in two ways. They can be both fair and foul. But aren't all prophecies both fair and foul? Aren't all prophecies two-sided, so the prophet is never accused of lying or giving the wrong prophecy? In fact, much of the action of this play develops from the ambiguity of the prophecies. Equivocation. Equivocation is a very important concept at this period in the Renaissance. Equivocation is telling a lie that looks like truth, or telling a truth that actually has two sides. The only example that has come to mind for me, and I don't think it's a very good one, is when you say to your kid, "Did you break that glass?" And the kid says, "Oh, the glass fell off the table and broke." Well, that's true, but he's equivocating. Now, there is a specific contemporary allusion in the notion of equivocation. And this word equivocation is going to come back to us the word itself will come back to us in the play, as well as the fact of equivocation. There was in 1605 a plot to blow up Parliament when the king was there, called the Gunpowder Plot. The Gunpowder Plot was created by the Jesuits. And in England, it was against the law to be Catholic in the early 1600s, late 1500s. You were either Anglican or dead. So the Jesuits were going to blow up Parliament. The plot was foiled, and the king's troops started rounding up Jesuits. Well, how could the Jesuits get around being questioned? And the answer was equivocation. So everybody was very aware that the Jesuits were equivocating when they were brought before the high courts in England. And so this word does refer clearly to the investigations of the Gunpowder Plot in 1605. So we're going to see a lot of equivocation in this play. There's another wonderful line, and actually a friend of mine used to teach a course with this title. Macbeth will refer to the fiend that lies like truth. And that's what equivocation is. It's the lie like truth. Now, we see perhaps the best example of the witch's equivocation in the prophecies that Macbeth demands of them in Act 4, after he has seen Banquos Ghost. First of all, at the beginning of this scene, which opens Act 4, we have this notion of doubleness, one of the more famous chants from the play. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. So the scene begins with that notion of duality, with that notion of doubleness. But Macbeth, since the murder of Banquo and the murder of Duncan, has, he feels, become a man in blood, steeped in so far that should I wade no more, returning it's tedious to go o'er. Think of the flowing river, but in this case, a flowing river of blood. And Macbeth is so far into the river that it's as hard for him to go back as to go forward. So he might as well just wade deeper into blood. And in order to protect himself, he must now return to the Weird Sisters to find out what's going to happen next. He says, I am bent to know by the worst means, the worst. In response to his demands, the Weird Sisters raise 3 apparitions, 3 phantoms who prophesy for Macbeth. The first tells him, beware Macduff. The second, be bloody, bold, and resolute. Laugh to scorn the power of man, for none of woman born shall harm Macbeth. The third encourages Macbeth, says, be lion-mettled, proud, and take no care who chafes, who frets, or where conspirers are. Macbeth shall never vanquished be until great burning wood to high Dunsinane Hill shall come against him. Of course, these last 2 prophecies suggest a supernatural or an unnatural world, a world out of order. How can burning wood come to Dunsinane? How can there be a man who's not born of woman? But thus Macbeth responds to the third spirit that will never be. Such things are inconceivable for him. Macbeth now feels himself invincible. He cannot be defeated. The prophecy, of course, has created a false sense of security, which rests on Macbeth's failures to understand that such prophecies are both fair and foul. For at the end, Birnam Wood does come to Dunsinane, and Macbeth is defeated by a man who has not been born of woman. Certainly, Macbeth's actions are to some extent a product of his and Lady Macbeth's reactions to the witch's prophecies. But to what extent? How responsible is the tragic hero of the play for his fate? We are told in the first scene that the witches have appeared specifically to meet with Macbeth. So clearly, before the start of the play, there have been forces at work in the world even before he meets the witches. Now, the witches' ability to actually make evil things happen is actually somewhat limited. And certainly, they cannot create a world in which Banquo's heirs become the kings. So clearly, their role must be to predict. They cannot make things happen. They can only see what will happen. But does Macbeth act because he has heard the prophecies? Or would he have killed Duncan anyway? These are really difficult questions to answer in the play. However, the prophecies, both fair and foul, appear to touch an ambition inherent in Macbeth, ambition that the evil forces of the witches represent can exploit to damn him. Banquo expresses to Macbeth the fear that the prophecies might yet enkindle you unto a crown. And he warns Macbeth and this is straight out of the mystery play. Oftentimes, to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truths, win us with honest trifles to betray us in deepest consequence. And Macbeth, in an aside, wonders, this supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good. If good, why do I yield to that suggestion whose horrid image doth unfix my hair and make my seated heart knock at my ribs against the use of nature? My thought, whose murder yet is but fantastical, shakes so my single state of man that function is smothered in surmise, and nothing is but what is not. That single state of man is Macbeth's courage. So Macbeth is both frightened and encouraged by the ambition witches have touched in him. But all these things exist for him in a double sense. We have here a man who is tempted by his darkest thoughts and encouraged first by the prophecies and then by his wife's ambition, who is certainly parallel to his own, if not perhaps greater. He gives into that temptation. But you see, like all of us, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth cannot know the consequences of their actions. Now, one of the things that I find interesting about Macbeth is that he's very much aware of the existence of ramifications, that there are consequences to action. He understands that actions are never complete in themselves, but over time set off a chain of reactions. As he contemplates the murder of Duncan, he realizes, if it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. If the assassination could trammel up the consequences and catch with his surcease success, that but this blow might be the be-all and end-all, here, but here, upon this bank and shoal of time, and notice that river metaphor again, upon this bank and shoal of time, we jump the life to come. But in these cases, we still have judgment here, that we but teach bloody instructions, which being taught, return to plague the inventor. To kill a king is a profound act. To commit a murder is a profound act. There must be consequences that will fall back upon him. There is a future. He knows the blood will have blood. And as his crimes increase and he becomes stained in blood, he's no longer able to consider the consequences of his actions. Earlier in the play, Lady Macbeth has accused her husband of considering things too closely. But following the murder of Banquo and the appearance of Banquos Ghost, Macbeth becomes a man for whom, from this first moment, the very first things of my heart shall be the first things of my hand. And even now, to crown my thoughts with act, be it thought and done. No more thought of consequences. On the other hand, Lady Macbeth is very different in this respect. She's unconcerned with or totally unaware of the consequences of their actions. For her, what's done is done. She argues to her husband that things without all remedy should be without regard. When Macbeth returns from killing Duncan, he is overwhelmed by his own blood-soaked hands, which of course are the symbol of his crime. He comes on stage, will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? No, this my hand will rather the multitudinous seeds incarnadine make the green one red. Lady Macbeth, on the other hand, says, my hands are of your color, but I shame to wear a heart so white. A little water clears us of this deed. How easy is it then? Lady Macbeth is, of course, one of the most intriguing women in all of Shakespeare's tragedies. Now, I got to point out at this point that you should keep in mind that Lady Macbeth was originally played by a boy. There were no women on the Renaissance stage. Imagine the kind of young actor who played this role. So Lady Macbeth reads the letter from Macbeth describing his experiences with the three weird sisters, and she, unlike her husband, has very few qualms about what has to be done. She likes the idea of being queen, but she worries that Macbeth is not up to the murder. Glams thou art, and Cawdor, and shalt be what thou promised. Yet do I fear thy nature. It is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way. Thou wouldst be great, art not without ambition, but without the illness that should attend it. And by the way, this is the first of several milk references to the play. There are various kinds of milk in the play. But at heart, milk is associated, of course, with motherhood and nurturing. And we'll see how that is destroyed over the life of the play. She is concerned that Macbeth is without that illness that should attend his ambition. She has that illness. But her problem is that she's a woman. Her role in God's ordained order is to be passive, generative, nurturing, kind, maternal, weak. These, of course, are the traits which are totally the opposite of those which define a man, and certainly the opposite of those which define the murderer of kings. How to take on the role necessary to make her husband that which fate and metaphysical aid doth seem to have thee crowned withal. Therefore she insists, come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here, and fill me from the crown to the toe topful of direst cruelty. Make thick my blood, stop up the access and passage to remorse. Rather than desiring that feminine milk of human kindness for which she contemns her husband, she demands, come to my women's breast and make my milk for gall, you murdering ministers. That milk of human kindness, that nurturing mother's milk, she would have turned to poison. Later, in what's probably the most shocking image of the entire play, Lady Macbeth makes clear the profundity of her willingness to be unsexed. She says to her husband, I have given suck and know how tender 'tis to love the babe that milks me. There's that milk again. I would, while I was smiling in my face, have plucked my nipple from his boneless gums and dashed his brains out, had I so sworn as you have done this. We see here a woman who at the end of the play will be called Macbeth's fiend-like queen. Macbeth tells his wife to bring forth men children only, for thy undoubted metal should compose nothing but males. However much she may dismiss them early in the play, even for Lady Macbeth, there will be consequences to her action. For one thing, their marriage disintegrates. In his letter to his wife, Macbeth addresses Lady Macbeth as my dearest partner of greatness. And when he returns home at the end of that scene, he greets her as my dearest love. By the end of the play, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are estranged, and he can't even generate the energy he needs to mourn her death. Furthermore, Lady Macbeth is, like her husband, unable to sleep, haunted by these terrible dreams that shake us nightly. After killing Duncan, Macbeth tells her, my thought I heard a voice cry, sleep no more. Macbeth doth murder sleep. The innocent sleep, sleep that knits up the raveled sleeve of care, the death of each day's life, sore labor's bath, balm of hurt minds, great nature's second course, chief nourisher in life's feast. Look at all these metaphors for sleep. Well, we all like to sleep, right? So this is what they're going to be denied, this balm. But both are denied sleep's virtues as a consequence of their actions. Glamis hath murdered sleep, and therefore Cawdor shall sleep no more. Macbeth shall sleep no more. Following the murder, Lady Macbeth had told her husband, these deeds must not be thought on after these ways, so they will make us mad. Of course, that's exactly what happens to her. Though she has said that a little water clears us of this deed, she is perpetually haunted by her guilt. And by the end of the play, she walks in her sleep every night, carrying a lighted candle because of her fear of the darkness, and trying to wash from her hands the remainder of Duncans blood, which she imagines. Out, damn spot, out I say. That's the voice of a queen, isn't it? Making demands. Yet who would have thought the old man to have so much blood in him? Here's the smell of blood still. All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. And as she returns to bed, she repeats, what is done cannot be undone. So she has finally learned Macbeth's lesson. The crimes are never done when they're done. A few scenes later, Macbeth is told of her death. And it's possible that Lady Macbeth has died by suicide. It's not clear in the play. For Lady Macbeth, these are the fruits of being unsexed and of killing a king. Now, as he waits for the signal from Lady Macbeth to kill Duncan, he too imagines things that are not there. And he has this phenomenal soliloquy in which he sees a dagger. Is this a dagger which I see before me, the handle torn by a hand? Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, and I see thee still. Art thou not, fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight? Or art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation proceeding from the heat of present brain? When Macbeth sees Banquo's ghost in his seat at the feast in Act 3, Banquo appears very real to him. Now, it's not clear whether Banquo's ghost is real or not real, because if you're a Renaissance ghost, you have an option. You can choose who you will appear to. So Banquo's ghost could have been real, and I think it probably was real, and have chosen only to appear to Macbeth. But, of course, Lady Macbeth thinks her husband's going crazy. This is a very painting of your fear. This is the air-drawn dagger which you said led you to Duncan. And she equates this dagger, which would be used to kill Duncan, and the ghost of Banquo. And clearly, whether Banquo's a real ghost or not, the dagger and the ghosts are manifestations of Macbeth's emotions, Macbeth's internal state, that dichotomy between external and internal. Now, the relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth suggests another important duality in the play, and that's the dichotomy between male and female, between what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. Gender and gender roles are very important elements in this play. This issue of gender roles is introduced at Macbeth and Banquo's first meeting with the witches. Banquo says, should be woman, but yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so. And here we have a wonderful painting by Fuseli of the witches and their beards. Are they men or are they women? Throughout this play, we're going to see this contrast between genders, between men's roles, strong, active, warlike, brave, decisive, but also violent, bloody, bold, and resolute, is to be manlike, and women's roles, again, passive, maternal, generative, nurturing, kind, weak. By the way, it's interesting that all of the evil forces in this play are female. The witches, Lady Macbeth. There is only one woman, Lady Macduff, who's female, like, would meet the standard criteria for female, and she's murdered along with her children. She's the one nurturing female in the play. But similar to the witches who are women with man-like qualities, Lady Macbeth would transcend the limitations of her gender. She would, as we've seen, become unsexed. I love this image. This is Sarah Siddons playing Lady Macbeth, a great 19th century actress. For the Renaissance English audience, this wish to be unsexed is clearly against nature, clearly unnatural. But I just want to briefly take a slightly different 21st century feminist look and suggest something slightly different. She's a woman in a society in which women's roles, especially motherhood, are clearly limiting. She lives in a world where men think things like the news of Duncan's death is, and I'm quoting Macduff here, "'Tis not for you to hear what I speak. The repetition in a woman's ear were murder as it fell." This being spoken to the woman who 10 minutes earlier we had seen hands covered in Duncans blood. When Duncan gives Macbeth a gift, it's the rank of the Thane of Cawdor. That involves land, it involves money, it involves increased power in the realm. When Duncan, who only refers to Lady Macbeth as his hostess, gives Lady Macbeth a gift, it's a diamond. Nice, but merely decorative. So only by being queen can Lady Macbeth achieve position and power. Otherwise, she's just the wife of a thane. Let's make that just another wife of another thane. So it's perfectly possible that her ambition, which is very roughly motivated in this play, is a response to the limitation she feels in a woman, as a woman in her society. It's the only way she's going to get position, a voice. Now, Macbeth initially tells her that he does not want to proceed with the assassination. He had written her the letter and she was all raring to go. Lady Macbeth immediately attacks him as unmanly. In response, he argues that I dare do all that may become a man. Who dares no more is none. And in that line, he is asserting that there are responsibilities and limitations that accrue to being a man. The meaning of man itself begins to expand, so it defines not only what it means to be a specific gender, but also what it means to be a human, because obviously man means human, right? We all know that. We are forced here to consider just what are the natural responsibilities of a human and what are the natural limitations of being a human. From this moment, Lady Macbeth repeatedly criticizes Macbeth for not being man enough. She sees herself as more of a man than her husband is. Unlike Macbeth, she doesn't acknowledge these responsibilities, these limitations that come with manhood, that come with humanness. So to goad her husband into killing the king, Lady Macbeth tells him, when you durst do it, then you were a man. And to be more than what you were, you would be so much more than man. In other words, to be more than what you were, to become king, you've got to go beyond the limitations that you define of manhood. It's by attacking her husband's manhood that she goads him to act. Now later, when Macbeth is terrified the appearance of Banquos Ghost, she asks him, "Are you a man?" And he asserts, "What man dare, I dare." But the appearance of the ghost goes beyond what man dares. It unmans him. And when Banquos Ghost finally disappears, Macbeth tells his wife, "I am man again." Of course, the appearance of the ghost is yet another manifestation of the disordered universe under Macbeth's reign as King of Scotland. Now, there's another much more subtle indication of this breakdown of order in this scene. as the guests come in, Macbeth opens the scene. He says, you know your own degrees, your places in the social hierarchy. Sit down, because you sit down in your proper seat in that order. But after the appearance of the Banquos Ghost, after Macbeth's outburst, it not only breaks up a great party, it totally upsets the appropriate hierarchy of the guests. At the end of the scene, it's Lady Macbeth who tells them, stand not upon the order of your going. Just go. The social order of the room breaks down, just as the social order in Scotland has broken down under this king. Now, we've talked about Lady Macbeth's rejection of motherhood and children. Parentage and offspring are important elements in this play. There are three principal sets of sons in the play, for example. The first, of course, is Fleance, Banquo's son. And his offspring, of course, which the witches will show Macbeth. Then there is Malcolm. That's Lawrence Harvey, the most noble Malcolm I've ever seen. Malcolm, and he has a brother, Donalbain, but Donalbain doesn't have a lot to do. So Malcolm, who will become the king at the end of the play. And then there's Macbeth's son, who'll be slaughtered in the middle of the play. So we have these three children, three male heirs of male nobles. When Macbeth hears the witch's initial prophecies, he's struck by the prediction that Banquo's offspring shall be the kings in the future. That it will be Banquo, not Macbeth, who will be the father of the future line of kings. And certainly, one of the events that leads Macbeth to regicide is Duncan's proclamation that his son, Malcolm, will be his heir. It's very unusual to name your heir like that in Scotland in those days, but Duncan makes Malcolm Prince of Cumberland, the equivalent of the Prince of Wales. Macbeth says, that is a step on which I must fall down or leap, for in my way it lies. If Malcolm is declared heir, Macbeth will not be the natural successor. That proclamation completely gets Macbeth out. The king, of course, is the parent of the nation. Early in the play, Macbeth tells Duncan that our duties are to your throne and state, children and servants. We're later reminded of this when Lady Macbeth returns from drugging Duncan's guards. And she notes that when she saw Duncan, had he not resembled my father as he slept, I had done it. The irony, of course, is rich here. Of course, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are childless. Certainly, one of the reasons that Macbeth wants Banquo and his son killed is his sense that upon my head they have placed a fruitless crown and put a barren scepter in my grip. Thence to be wrenched with an unlineal hand, no son of mine succeeding. If it be so, for Banquo's issues have I filed my mind. For them, the gracious Duncan, have I murdered, but rancors in the vessel of my peace, only for them, and mine eternal jewel given to the common enemy of man to make them kings, the seeds of Banquo, king. Notice here also Macbeth's awareness that he has damned himself forever. Again, that mystery play root. Notice also those key terms here. Oops, sorry. Fruitless crown, barren scepter. This is the language of impotence. This is not the language of breeding. So it suggests Macbeth's own inability to breed. Unlike Duncan, he is not the father of his nation. Now, the witches will show Macbeth generation after generation of Banquo's royal descendants. And again, Macbeth sees another indication of the futility of his life's actions. Now, somewhat related to this is the notion of time. The notion of time pervades the play. We see it, by the way, in the first line of the play. When shall we three meet again? It's a question that suggests time future. Remember I said earlier, there will be a future. Well, there will be a future when the witches meet again. Now, Shakespeare was always very concerned with the nature of time and with the nature of things that occur over time. Indeed, in this play, Macbeth's, the futility of Macbeth's actions occur over time. And one of the great, all of the sonnets, at least the early sonnets of Shakespeare, are really about the nature of time and time's destructive force and the ability of art to transcend time. Here, I'm going to start that sentence again. So, time is an essential element in the world of this play. The word time occurs in Macbeth 39 times. It says something about. I think it occurs a little less than sleep, but I'm not sure. So, we have the witches who at the beginning of the play suggest time future. And Banquo suggests that the witches have this ability to look into the seeds of time, to predict what will grow there in the future. That organic imagery. We have Macbeth, impotent, but we have time moving forward, growing as an organic thing throughout the life of the world, actually. So, in this concern with future time, we see a reflection of Macbeth's own concern with the consequences of his action. After all, his actions will occur in the future, won't they? And his concern with generation, because that's the future. We noted how Macbeth speaks of time as being like a flowing river. And his awareness of the consequence of his actions is an awareness of the ways in which events work themselves out in this river of time. It flows forward. Things constantly evolve, but they don't evolve as we think they will. They don't evolve as we hope they will. Rather, he becomes, as we all do, what Shakespeare calls in one of his sonnets, time's fool. By the end of the play, Macbeth understands that the witch's prophecy are the equivalent of the fiend that lies like truth. Now, in the final act of the play, Macbeth has come to see and come to understand what he has lost. I have lived long enough. My way of life has fallen into the sere, the yellow leaf. And that which should accompany old age is honor, love, obedience, troops of friends. I must look not to have. But in their stead, curses, not loud, but deep, mouth honor, breath, which the poor heart would fain deny and dare not. That wonderful list of the things that one should have as old age and what he's got. As I said, his response to the news of Lady Macbeth's death, in what is arguably the most famous speech in the play, is a reflection actually on time. It is his truth about life lived over the passage of time. He's besieged by his enemies. He's exhausted by his isolation. He has now seen how fruitless his actions have been and what the cost has been to him. Now, his wife is dead, and he no longer has the ability or even the leisure to feel the weight of her death. She should have died hereafter. There would have been time for such a word. after what he early had called life's fitful fever, the passage of life, Macbeth has concluded that tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It's a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. This is the voice of a man who's come to know the meaninglessness of his life, the meaninglessness of his crimes, the price of his ambition. I begin to be aweary of the sun and wish the estate of the world were now undone. When, in the final moments of the play, he's confronted by Macduff and learns that Macduff is not of woman born, but was from his mother's womb untimely ripped, the truth of the witch's prophecies become clear to him. Accursed be that tongue that tells me so, for it hath cowed my better part of man. And be these juggling fiends no more believed than palter with us in a double sense, that keep the word of promise to our ear and break it to our hope. He faces Macduff with resignation, with bravery, but with acceptance of his inevitable defeat. Though Burnham would be come to Dunsinane, and thou oppose, being of no woman born, yet I will try the last. Before my body I throw my warlike shield. Lay on, Macduff, and Dan be him that first cries hold enough. As he expects, Macbeth is defeated by Macduff. Macduff cuts off his head and holds it high for everyone to see. Behold where stands the usurper's cursed head. The time is free. The kingship is restored to Duncan's heir, and order has been restored to Scotland and to the universe. Our final image is of Macduff holding high Macbeth's severed head. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes.
I have a couple. One, I'm confounded by what really does, if he doesn't have heirs, and he knows he's not going to have heirs, what does motivate him to want to become king sufficiently to commit all these murders?
Power.
But this person, I mean, so
To be king, well, that and his wife, but power. I mean, the play so much blames his wife, right? So much blames Lady Macbeth. But it's his ambition she's playing on. She has her own. It may be greater than his. But it's power. It's the kingship. To be king of Scotland.
just personally, because so often you see these stories and there's the desire to have one's heirs, take on.
And that's clearly the case later on with Macbeth. But early in the play, it's just about power. It's just, I can be king. I've been told I can be king. It's a nice job. I want that job. And remember, he's that far away from it. He's the king's first cousin. They have the shade of grandfather. Macbeth could have been the heir, but he wasn't because his father was older. Okay? Yeah.
What would the witches gain?
Sorry?
What were the witches gain?
Oh, what were they gaining? They were gaining the damnation of the human soul. That's their job. They work for the devil. They work for Satan. Thank you for asking that question. It's a good question, Patty. They really come from the satanic forces in the world. And that's that mystery, the morality play root, that Satan damning another human soul. Yeah, exactly.
Douglas, do you think in this work there is a reflection on the question of free will, and that somehow Macbeth is a victim of a strong belief in destiny?
I really wish you hadn't asked that. And the reason I really wish you hadn't asked that is that, oh yeah, could you repeat the question? Because your mic wasn't on.
Oh, you just repeated.
Oh, yeah, I can't, I'd rather.
No,
Okay.
question-
Okay, the question was what is the role of fate and what is the role of predestination in this? And the reason I wish you hadn't asked that question is because I had to consider whether or not I really wanted to get into that, and it takes you into such complex stuff that I just decided to leave it out. But a couple of things about that. Certainly, I've got to think this through. I've got to be careful what I say here. Certainly, Macbeth is fated through the action of the witches. Because remember, the witches are there to meet Macbeth. That's why they're there. That's the soul they're after, right? So certainly, if you have this notion of fate, he is fated. Predestination is a tricky word. To take the journey that he takes, right? I always think in terms of fate and predestination, not necessarily as Shakespearean notions, but certainly, Hamlet says, "My fate cries out," and Hamlet's fated to again go through that journey. I always think of it really more in Greek terms, and Shakespeare's not a Greek tragedian. He's a Shakespearean tragedian. He's dealing more with human responsibility for their own actions. But I don't think that you can write a tragedy without considering the notion of fate, without considering the notion of predestination. But you see, then you get into the question is, what does it mean as fate? What does it mean as to be predestined? And pardon me if I use a Greek example, because it's the easiest one for me to use, rather than a Shakespearean example. And that is Oedipus, right? Oedipus's parents go to Delphi, and they give him a double-edged prediction, right? Now we got to figure out what it means. But it's predicted that he will kill his father and marry his mother, right? Now, what happens? Well, on one level, Oedipus kills his father and marries his mother, right? Did that happen because he was fated to kill his father and marry his mother? That was predestined. Or did it happen because Oedipus's parents tried to get around that prediction? Fair is foul and foul is fair. This kid who was raised in Corinth grew up with a terrible temper, is traveling back toward Thebes, runs across this old man who doesn't stop at a red light, gets angry and kills him. Is that fate? Is that predestination? Or is that character? The Greeks, of course, would have read it as fate and predestination. Do you see why I didn't want to get into that tonight? You got that? So that's why it's such a great question. Because when you start dealing with notions of fate or predestination with Shakespeare, you start wading into all these very complex aesthetic questions about the nature of fate and predestination in art. So thank you for asking that, because it was like the right question. Yeah, Magda.
Thank you. Thanks, a great explanation. I would love to have you develop a little bit on the gender question, that Lady Macbeth was the more male and she wanted to power, while he is more female, having, at least in the beginning, you're not a man, no, you've said that, right. But then he aspires to take power and to become a man. No?
Because he is a man.
This playing with this gender role, is this new in Shakespeare? Macbeth, or did Shakespeare play with this role already earlier and find something or later? I would like to see what. I mean, this is 1600.
1605.
Yeah.
Well, again, that's a really tricky question. So when you start talking about playing with gender roles, right? In the tragedies, off the top of my head, and somebody is going to, because my mind is really on Macbeth, and it's not kind of looking at the in the tragedies, I'm going to say this is the only play in which he plays with gender roles in that way. But Shakespeare is always playing with gender roles. All the comedies are built on gender transformations, right?
Yes, you explained that the female roles are played
You,
by
you,
the-
you got
by
female
the
roles being
boy.
played by boys, right? And then, of course, in the comedies, you got boys playing girls playing boys, and occasionally boys playing girls playing boys playing girls. He's always playing with gender roles, you know. So this is, but in the tragedies, I think this is the only one where he's really playing with gender in this way and really dealing with that. Other questions? Yeah, Hunter.
I'm thinking about the witches, and I'm thinking about how does this map onto, I mean, the whole idea of are we to take the witches seriously, that Shakespeare believed
Yes.
in witches, all of that, and this is not that long after the Inquisition.
Well, Inquisition is active.
Active, okay.
Oh yeah, Inquisition
so
is
how
active up until the early 1700s.
Okay, so how does the role of the witches map onto the
Keep in mind, this is a
Inquisition?
Protestant country. It is not a Catholic country. The Inquisition isn't evil. And it, you know, if you're a Jesuit, and those are the guys who are doing the Inquisition, you're going to be burned at the stake. So Inquisition is just not an issue for England. I can't say that Shakespeare took witches seriously, but I can say that his boss took witches seriously. James
Okay.
I wrote the book on demonology.
That's what I wanted to know, yeah.
Yeah, so, yeah. But the Catholic issues are not issues here. Okay? Any other questions? Well, thank you all very much. Thank you.